Synopsis of the books of the Bible. 1 Samuel. By JND Darby. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. 2 Timothy 3 verses 16 and 17. Synopsis of the books of the Bible. By John Nelson Darby. 1 Samuel, chapter 25. At length, Samuel dies. This forms an epoch because he who was the true link between the people and God was gone. Israel acknowledged him when dead, although they had despised him while living. Abigail's faith compared with that of Jonathan, her acknowledgement of David in rejection. And now David's position changes and Abigail is brought in. Jonathan never separated from the system in which he stood, never united himself to David, although loving him, and never shared his sufferings. But Abigail identifies herself with him. Existing relationships do not prevent her from acknowledging David, and she is united to him after her husband's death. Jonathan prefigures the remnant in the character of the remnant of Israel, who acknowledge the future king, and adhere to him, but go no farther. As regards old Israel, they come to nothing with it. They will be blessed as reigned over in the kingdom, but not be associated with Christ on the throne. Jonathan does not suffer with David and does not reign with him. He remains with Saul, and, as to that position, his career ends with Saul. Abigail and even the malcontents who joined David shared his sufferings. Abigail separates herself completely from the spirit of her husband, and it is on account of her faith and wisdom that David spares Nabal's life. God judges the latter, and then Abigail becomes the wife of David. Historically, David had nearly failed in his high standing. In fact, it is on account of the faithful remnant, the Abigail of the foolish nation, that Israel itself has been spared, and the Lord's connection with the assembly is in the character of pure grace, not in that of the avenger, as hereafter with Israel. At this time it is that David, during his rejection, surrounds himself with those who will be the companions and the retinue of his glory in the kingdom. But he also takes a wife. Abigail speaks of Saul as a man. Jehovah, she says, will make a sure house to David. This is the intelligence of faith. See note 1. It is the truth of God's counsels, 2 Samuel 7 verse 11, and in its fullness, as to this. She was forming for herself, without knowing it, the position of the assembly. In the future, she was preparing for herself. See note 2. Note 1. In fact, when the priesthood had been judged, nothing remained for faith, which apprehended the mind of God, except the prophet Samuel and the king given by God, David. Abigail understands this. The assembly should think as God himself thinks, in spite of existing circumstances. Abigail thinks nothing of Saul. Samuel is dead, David is now everything to her. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time the kingdom of heaven is preached, and every man presses into it. Where were the high priests and all their company? Nevertheless, the Lord submitted to them as to an ordinance, as David did to Saul. End of note 1. Note 2. She takes a much more humble place than Jonathan did, and one which, even at the time, acknowledged David much more fully. It is not a friend like Jonathan. It is a submissive soul which, in spirit, gives David his place according to God, taking her own place before him. It is exactly that which distinguishes the spirit of the assembly, of the true Christian. In Jonathan, we see the remnant under the Jewish aspect. But Abigail enters into the spirit of God's purposes respecting David, although he was now in distress, and David, who, while thoroughly submissive, can act according to the faith that owns him, hears her voice, and accepts her person. Let us mark the features of Abigail's faith. All rests upon her appreciation of David. It is this which forms a Christian's judgment. In every respect, he appreciates Christ, his title as owned of God, his personal perfection, and that which belonged to him according to the counsels of God. She thinks of him according to all the good which God has spoken of him. She sees him fighting God's battles, where others only see a rebel against Saul, and all this from her heart. She judges Nabal, and looks upon him as already judged of God on account of this, for with her everything is judged according to its connection with David. Verse 26. a judgment which God accomplishes 10 days later. Although Nabal was at peace in his own house, and David an exile and outcast, nevertheless, the relation of Abigail to Nabal is recognized until God executes judgment. She judges Saul. He is but a man, because, to her faith, David is king. All her desire is that David may remember her. Jonathan says, when he goes out to David, I shall be next unto thee. And David abides in the wood, while Jonathan returns to his house in the order of things which God had judged, a judgment that faith recognized. He remains with his family and shares its ruin. This is important to a Christian. For instance, he respects, insofar as based on God's authority, official Christianity, which, in the world, is the religion of God while God bears with it, and does not stand up against it. As to faith and personal walk, this Christianity is nothing at all, just as Saul was only a man to Abigail's faith. End of note 2.